are talking Stuffings, and this is an Australian Christmas comedic horror movie written and directed by Mathew J. Wilkinson. It's a low-budget movie put out by Bounty Films. Now, unlike many Christmas horror films, because this is set in Australia, the weather there is quite different from the majority of Christmas movies that we see, because it's kind of their summer. So it is a bright, hot, sunny Christmas movie, albeit it takes place kind of in the same kind of type of calendar year. Now, what is the story? It focuses on these two YouTubers who are a couple and have been doing a channel which has had some success, but their views are starting to decline. They're kind of a little bit worried about what they're going to do, what's going to be kind of the next big thing, and they're out in the kind of the wilderness somewhere, just trying to hope to capture something on film and, you know, have a good idea for their kind of channel, etc. And they happen across a young girl who seems to be running away from someone. And they see this as an opportunity to try and maybe capture real crime on film and kind of get their kind of viewings up with kind of some explosive new content. However, there's something that they don't know. Just nearby to them is a small kind of rural community which seems to have summoned some type of demonic entity which takes the effigy of a kind of Santa Claus style kind of character. And the town and the kind of the wilderness has these kind of Santa Claus scarecrow kind of props kind of put up everywhere, and this town seems to need to make some kind of sacrifices to this creature or spirit, wherever it might be, to try and appease it. And these two YouTubers have happened just to walk right into their hunt for you know, sacrificial offerings. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So this is described as a horror comedy. Now, just to kind of give you a bit more on the tone of this film, I wouldn't say that it's an out-and-out comedy. It's comedic, but not really a comedy. So the kind of the jokes and the gags here, they pay kind of second fiddle really to the kind of the actual story. But it is a movie which has its tongue in cheek. It's not one that you take particularly seriously. I mean, we have this kind of like text that comes up at the beginning of the movie, and that will kind of give you a hint of the tone. But things, you know, are going to take place, you know, quote unquote, in the kind of the real world, so to speak. We just have some kind of like silly kind of moments and things like this. Okay, so what do I think of this movie? Now, this is a very, very low budget film, but I have to say it has this kind of like charming grindhouse quality to it. And I think it kind of goes in with that kind of Aussie charm, because everyone here is kind of very kind of rough and ready. And I think it does kind of suit this movie coming kind of from Australia, in the kind of the outback, with these kind of characters who, you know, are very kind of Australian, stereotypical Australians in some respects. But it kind of works with this kind of like this low budget aesthetic, and has this kind of like exploitation, kind of grindhouse kind of feel to it. And I think that the low budget actually does work in its favour some of the time. I actually quite like the fact that our two protagonists are actually YouTubers. Now, admittedly, I may be quite biased at this, because being a YouTuber myself, and obviously anyone who's watching it would have some experience of YouTube, you kind of see the kind of the things that, and you know, you understand what the characters are kind of talking about, maybe a little bit more compared to someone who maybe doesn't really watch YouTube and things like that. But nonetheless, I found it quite interesting having these kind of these YouTubers essentially as protagonists, and I kind of quite like their kind of the chemistry between the two of them. They do seem like a couple. They have these kind of little spats and things like that, trying to kind of prank each other, and I quite like their kind of their setup. Again, they're kind of played slightly silly, particularly the kind of the male YouTuber, but nonetheless, I still thought like they made some quite kind of likable, but kind of like doofus style kind of like lead kind of characters here. The idea of these kind of like these Santa Claus type scarecrow things, I mean, it's very kind of low budget, but there are a couple of instances where I do feel it does look kind of freaky looking. Now, one of the design aesthetics here is obviously, because we are talking an Australian Christmas, it's all very kind of sunny and hot. So seeing this kind of Santa Claus outfit walking around in the kind of the bright sunshine, and in the kind of obviously a quite a summer atmosphere, and kind of with people dressed you know, appropriately, so to speak, it kind of looks very out of place in a weird sort of way. And again, it kind of goes into this weird sort of like feeling that this movie has, because you have this Christmas iconography here, but in a kind of a setting that, if you're not from Australia or that kind of region, you know, us in England or Europe or the States or something, it kind of looks a little weird, but it does feel that much kind of uncomfortable because of it in a kind of a weird way. The movie, I have to say, is quite well paced. It's a relatively kind of short film, and as such has quite a kind of a punchy feel. And I do feel I kind of got to know the kind of the characters pretty well, even outside of our main two characters that were introduced, for example, to this kind of this little girl and the kind of some of the kind of the people from this town, and they have a couple of little kind of like fleshing out to the kind of the characters as well, which I kind of quite appreciated. And although I didn't think this movie was, you know, really laugh out loud funny in regards to its kind of comedy sensibilities, nonetheless there are a couple of moments that I did feel mildly kind of amused at, you know, and kind of enjoyed it in this kind of like this fun, tongue-in-cheek kind of aesthetic, rather than being an out-and-out, you know, rolling in the aisle style comedy. Okay, let's talk about what doesn't work. As I've kind of mentioned, this movie is very, very low budget, and it does show. And I think people who don't really like real kind of like guerrilla filmmaking may be put off by the obvious kind of like budgetary constraints this movie has, because it really does have a very kind of low budget kind of gonzo kind of style of filmmaking, and everything here, as I've mentioned, is rough and ready, and some of which I think does benefit the movie, but some does come across as somewhat awkward and kind of like awkwardly done at times. Some of the performances here seem like they don't know, the actors just don't know what they're supposed to be doing. In particular, I would say some of the supporting characters, some of the townsfolk of this kind of small rural community, who have some lines but not many. They just seem particularly kind of uncomfortable in kind of some scenes, that they haven't been given particularly kind of good direction about, you know, what they're supposed to be doing. And I always notice kind of the physical acting, what kind of people are doing with their arms and things like this in certain sequences, and you just see characters look particularly awkward, not really knowing how to move. It looks like the director here hasn't kind of given them good enough, you know, example of what they want, and therefore people kind of like stumble around kind of awkwardly to a certain degree. Our main two actors, I think, don't have this problem. I think they seem to be a little bit more kind of on top of it. Some of the smaller characters, the supporting roles here, seem a little bit kind of, in their kind of delivery of dialogue and the way they're kind of physically acting, seems kind of, you know, not particularly kind of confident. So in regards to the comedy and horror, here's the thing I think, again, maybe more of a major criticism here. I don't think it really goes in either direction or in a particular kind of strong way. As I've mentioned about the comedy, it's kind of like mildly amusing, but not particularly kind of out and out funny. It may have wanted to go more so in the kind of the absurd, if you ask me. In some ways, I don't think this movie goes far enough in regards to its kind of absurd kind of nature and things like this, and these kind of weird antagonists that we have in regards to these kind of Santa scarecrows. It could have been a completely kind of like madcap adventure, but instead I think it just plays its cards a little bit too close to its chest and being tongue-in-cheek and comedic rather than kind of like just balls to the wall bizarre. Equally, I think the horror isn't particularly kind of done to a kind of a real, you know, scary. This movie is not scary in any particular kind of way. There are the kind of the main kind of Santa Claus creature, I have to say, is a somewhat comedic look and quite interesting, but it's never really scary outside of maybe a couple of shots here and there where it just looks a little bit kind of freaky. And the fact that this kind of Santa creature looks like a handmade scarecrow, I think could have lent itself to a more of a, you know, a creepy image of more of a disturbing kind of antagonist, having it the way it moved and that sort of thing. But instead it just is a little bit kind of like hokey and kind of silly at times, and just kind of looks like there's someone dressed in a, you know, a Santa Claus outfit with a kind of a couple of extra bits on to kind of make it a little bit weird looking. So I think the movie doesn't really go, it doesn't it doesn't kind of like venture into horror particularly well, nor does it kind of venture into kind of comedy all that much. So instead you have this somewhat kind of like playing it middle of the road, never really going particularly in one direction or another, and therefore kind of loses a little bit of kind of bite, either way, essentially, it being a kind of a bizarre comedy or a kind of a more a grindhouse kind of real exploitation kind of style comedies. That it's quite light on both. And to be honest with you, there's not really any kind of originality in the actual story. It's a relatively simple kind of story, which is you can kind of guess what's going to happen and things like that. Overall, I think it's a pleasant enough movie to watch. Its low budget sensibilities may be a little bit too kind of like on the cheap side for some, and as I said, it really does kind of show through on screens, but in some aspects I do think that works. So if you're prepared to watch a lower budget kind of grindhouse gonzo style movie, I think you'll enjoy its kind of rough and ready kind of sensibilities. And I quite like the characters, I quite like the idea, and I do still like the kind of Santa Claus things to a point. More could have been done with them. I think we needed to know a little bit more about the circumstances of what they're actually doing and things like that. So it's a little bit light on mythology, I have to say. Overall, I'm going to give this a 4 out of 10. It's a below average movie, but it's still, I think, watchable to crowds who would appreciate a low budget B movie. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.